what are you planning for this year?
I found it quite tricky. I don't know what you've been, setting fastest known time records left, right, and centre. But here in southwest London, I found it quite tricky to, without kind of any knowledge of what on earth is happening, actually plan for stuff. And then training runs, which were always, as long as time permitted, as family commitments and work commitments permitted. That was if I could squeeze in another couple of hours, I'd always stay out for those 2 hours. I've just gone, oh no, I'll just go back and and see the kids and see Caroline and see what's going on. So without any kind of actual things on the horizon. I mean, Comrades was last year, and then it was cancelled last year, it's cancelled this year, and I wanted to do some of the big American 100-milers. I thought that would be really awesome, but again, it's quite difficult. So I haven't got anything. I want to do a Bob Graham, and I have been spending the odd weekend in the lakes, sort of earning it in my sort of silly head. I feel like if I've run at least each of the 5 legs on their own, then I'll have and nabbed it myself. Then I've earned the right at a round attempt. So I quite like to do that. How about you?
Yeah, I think this year, a bit like last year, it is a good time to. I mean, I think races will they have started to come back on, but
yeah.
It is a good time to think about, I suppose, personal projects and so on. So I do have a little scheme in mind for late May, which I'll keep to myself for now, if you don't mind. But yeah, I've got a plan for late May, which is an FKT attempt. And then after that, I'm still not really sure. Yeah, whether the big races will be back on or not. I do have a place at UTMB. I might have to see what John Kelly does on the Pennine Way. He's going to go and have another go. We'll see, I suppose.
So
yeah.
let's talk about your last year's FKTs, and the Pennine Way was the big one, wasn't it? And you have, I've learned from your book, you had previous with the Pennine Way, not just with the race, but also you'd written, wasn't that one of your first journalistic assignments, was to write a guide for the Pennine Way? So what is it about the Pennine Way and you, before we get onto the record?
Well, it came at I don't know how interesting this is to anyone else, but it came at an interesting moment for me where I spent most of the previous decade, most of the noughties, abroad, traveling or living in Australia. And I'd only recently got back to Britain, and I was kind of, I don't know, re-exploring Britain and re-exploring my own sort of identity and national identity. And around that time, I was very lucky to be handed the opportunity to do a guidebook for the Pennine Way. So it sort of tied in with exploring Britain, and the Pennine Way happens to be our original national trail. It ties in with also the mass trespass from 1932, which I hope most people know about, but maybe they don't. It was this wonderful moment of civil disobedience that happened on Kinder Scout in the Peak District, where local people were just fed up that they weren't allowed to access all this private land, all these hills. People from Manchester couldn't really go hill walking at a weekend because it was all privately owned, and they just thought that was unfair. So they trespassed deliberately. A lot of them were arrested, put in prison. But that moment spurred change, political change, and opened some of the moorlands up for us. And I think it was still another 30 years before the Pennine Way actually came into existence, but it did happen. So there's a real wonderful political moment of people power linked to the Pennine Way, which I think is really, really special and is really important to remember. And then also when you hike it, it's interesting what you think, because moorland, there's a lot of peat bog and barren moorland. To some people it's kind of bleak. Well, I think to everyone it's bleak, but it's whether you like that bleakness. And definitely it's been interesting, we kind of forget maybe, the Lake District is similar, and even the Scottish Highlands, like there's almost no trees, and there used to be lots of trees there. Now the Pennine sort of moors, I grew up a bit on Dartmoor as well, so I quite like moors. There's sort of this atmosphere to them of I don't know, impending drama or something. But really, it's quite an interesting landscape because it's not a natural landscape. It should have trees on there, but so there's lots of, I think, things to think about. There's lots of different aspects to the Pennine Way, and it's just our oldest national trail as well. So Yeah, I think it has a lot of, what's the word, potency or pregnancy or
Yeah.
something. You're a better writer than me. You know a good word for that.
I'm not a better writer than you, and I'm definitely not a better runner. I thought, funnily enough, I thought the Watkin Path was the first public footpath in
Sorry,
Britain.
no. What I mean is the oldest national trail. The national
Okay.
trails, I think there are 15 of them in England and Wales, and they're sort of government funded. But there are lots of other footpaths, hundreds and
Yeah.
thousands of other footpaths.
Yeah.
So you could well be right. And often the Ridgeway is seen as like a lot older than the Pennine Way,
Yeah.
because the Ridgeway has been used by, I think Romans and so on for decades, for centuries. But the national trails is a sort of, a more recent government initiative. So yeah, it's not as historical as some, but in some context you could claim it was. But I've probably gone in too deep into the weeds there. But I didn't know that
that was my first one, incidentally. That was my first ultra, was the Ridgeway and Race to the Stones, which was awesome and just got me completely hooked. So what this, I mean, the record, which was 61 hours and change, which is astonishing. How did that? Was that a different thing? And also, by the way, the picking up litter along the way, chapeau, that was just such a lovely touch. How did that change you? I mean, that was the thing that really kind of garnered national momentum, and you were everywhere, weren't you?
It was quite crazy. I think what really helped with the story was that my friend and sort of neighbour in the next county, John Kelly, because he had gone for it just before me, it added a whole sense of drama that no one had broken the record for 31 years, and then two people break the record in just over a week. And I suppose it looked a bit like someone broke the record, and I thought, oh, I'll go and have a good go at that. But I've been thinking about it for 4 years, and planning it for 3 or 4 months. Once I knew UTMB was cancelled, and me and John were chatting a lot on WhatsApp, helping each other with information and so on. But yeah, it was quite crazy. I think it was in the Guardian. I was on some radio stations. We were both live on BBC TV. I think on the Monday morning, which was a very surreal experience. So it was kind of crazy. But also, I think it was quite a nice moment. There were quite a few records being broken around then, and it was kind of lockdown was just ending. And also, I think you've got all these sports pages and all these sports journalists with no sport to report on. So it's sort of like, oh, there's a bit of sport. Let's report on that. But hopefully it added some optimism to a time of a strange year. It was a bit crazy.
Because you did Paddy Buckley last year as well.
Yeah, so early on, right at the beginning of the year, I'd decided, I wanted to do a sort of a winter adventure, and so I went around the Paddy Buckley on my own in winter. And that we
should just explain to people what the Paddy Buckley is for people who don't know. I'm sure if you're watching the London Mountain Film Festival, you know all about the Paddy Buckley round. And actually, we mentioned Bob Graham, and we didn't mention what that is. So Bob Graham in the Lake District, Paddy Buckley in Wales.
Yes. So the Bob Graham is the classic, the original kind of. You could almost say, actually, I've tried to research this as much as I could for my book. You could almost say that's one of the original FKTs in the world, in that it's a well-established challenge. It was a hiking challenge to start with. But obviously, as people you get faster and people start running bits. But even now, people hike the long uphills. And the Paddy Buckley is kind of the Welsh version of the Bob Graham. The Bob Graham's in the Lake District. They're both, the Paddy Buckley is 47 mountain tops, and you're meant to do it in under 24 hours. And the Bob Graham, and then there's another one in Scotland called the Charlie Ramsey. They must be climbing up your wish list, Vassos, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what I'd love to do. Where do you live, Damian?
Wiltshire.
Okay, so no, you have the same problem as me. I can't use that as an excuse then. I was imagining with your terrible Wi-Fi that you were somewhere really remote in the sort of the back Joss Naylor country in the back of the Lake District. But no,
I wish.
I just like to lasso like Wales, especially the mountainous bit, and the lakes, and possibly the Highlands. Just bring them like 3 or 4 hours closer, or maybe me move closer. But because I've got a young kid and I've got teenage kids and I've got a job in London. It's just finding the time to just do the training. But yeah, obviously I think that's where my future lies. You know, I don't want to try and break records, but just something about being in the mountains which just sings to my soul, and you must find that too.
Yeah, and I almost forget it's about running. You know, it's a combination of sort of movements, isn't it? And so many different skills, and often you just get distracted. And I often just end up sort of daydreaming and almost forget that running is the thing you're doing. But I must say, I've always wanted to ask you. I mean, you see, things like Spartathlon, that hasn't appealed to me because I suppose, because it's tarmac and it sounds like you're fighting with traffic. But I'm so in awe of people who do that race because it sounds so much tougher than doing it in the mountains. I know the Bob Graham or something like UTMB sounds tough to people, and it is. But to me, because it's somewhere scenic and the terrain is changing so much, that makes it in a way easier to me than something like Spartathlon. So I'm intrigued as to, yeah, I mean, that's incredible doing Spartathlon. I mean, how do you do that?
It's a tough old challenge, and you know they do say it's like a massively mental challenge, but they do play with you as well. I think you have to do the first marathon in 3 hours 40, something like that, which is just a little bit punchy when you've all got 5 to go afterwards, and it's kind of rolling roads out of Athens. But for me, I'm Greek. It's like the original Phidippides, the original ultra runners of old were Greek messengers who would, you know, if you needed to get word to Sparta quickly, which they did, they sent their best guy, who was Phidippides, you know, run 150 miles over the mountains, over the Peloponnese to Sparta and ask them for help. And Sparta said no. So he had to run back and say, sorry, there's going to be no help. And then he had to run and, you know, fight in the battle. That history and the way that the Greek nation, they're very aware of it. So I as a Greek, I've spent a lot of time in Athens. And when you start, it's something, as the dawn rises over the Acropolis, it's something like 6-7 o'clock in the morning on a Friday. And they stop traffic in central Athens for 300 ultra nutters to try to run to Sparta in the time. And all the hoots, and I can tell, all the hoots and everyone leading out of cars and shouting at us, they were all encouragement. They all didn't care that you were adding time to their journey. And they're not known, Greek drivers, for their patience. But they absolutely, you know, they couldn't be more on board with this, because they felt, rightly, they felt that we were celebrating Greek history and culture by taking part. You know, that run was in many ways to save this nascent thing called democracy. And especially it felt when I did it with President Trump in the White House that that was something really that needed doing. Even today, it still sort of resonated. And that's, you know, and there is one mountain at least, you know, and it's always in the dark. So there's one, it's 4,000 foot, but you sort of it doesn't feel like it. It's weird.
Wow.
And that comes at about 100 miles in. But the Spartathlon, well, I mean, I don't know. It's got no place in a mountain film festival. But it was. I would recommend it, because in the middle of the night you go through these villages who all, you know, schools have had the day off to come to the nearest point in the route and cheer you on. The villages have like parties in the middle of the night, and every time a runner comes, which is not very often, because, you know, especially by then, loads of people have dropped out, and you're sort of quite well spaced, obviously, around a 150-mile route. They just make such a fuss of you, and it's so, you know, so humbling and so kind of wonderful that you reach the statue at the end, and it's one of the great moments of my life, that that, you know. And then I wasn't able to walk for, you know, a week. I was on a Zimmer frame because my legs aren't used to that sort of punishment. What state were you in? When's the state? Was it after the Pennine Way? When have you been at your most kind of stripped bare?
Well, first of all, I must backtrack slightly. You've opened my mind there. You've made me think. I've always thought I don't fancy that one. I've got to be honest. You've made me think maybe I would do that one day, because that was such a wonderful description, and gave it. But also to you, I could tell there was so much meaning for you for that race. And increasingly, I'm learning that's so important when you do a big challenge that's really, really going to test you and put you in the dark places. As the more meaning you can put into it, the more personal you can make it, the more successful I think, the more chance of you completing it are. And I really learned that with the Pennine Way. I did actually speak to a sports psychologist beforehand, because I just thought I've got to leave no stone unturned to prepare.
Yeah.
And she really encouraged me to make it as, put as much meaning as possible. So partly the litter, picking up the litter, in a way it sounds like a fairly trivial act. And to be honest, most of my pacers did most of the work. But that had a value attached to it, which, was sort of an environmental message. And that made it more meaningful for me. It mattered more to me to make sure I did it and did it well. So it was sort of almost a selfish trick to help me finish it. But in terms of my worst, I think it probably has to be my first spine race. I was only about a year and a half into the sport, really. It was only my 5th race, and I shouldn't really have been doing it that soon, I don't think. But I had already walked the Pennine Way, so there was that personal history with it already. But yeah, the spine race, for those who don't know, is the Pennine Way, 260-ish miles in winter. So it's pretty much, it's mostly dark, it's boggy. The clock's always ticking, so the temptation is not to sleep much at all. So you get quite messed up there. I couldn't run for 7 weeks afterwards, and I used to be a size medium for t-shirts, and I've always been a size small ever since the spine race is probably one of the best ways of describing it. I was my most messed up there, I think, mentally and physically.
I'm going to find something from your book when you say messed up, because you say, you talk about runner's high. It's somewhere close. Here you go. Runner's high. And now your runner's high must be a lot better than my runner's high. I'm going to say this from the offset, because you say runner's high. Do you remember what you said?
Maybe not.
Runner's high is like an orgasm.
Not for you. Maybe maybe an orgasm.
I find it more sort of contentment. I find it like it's this deep bubble of contentment. I actually liken it to, like a good hard day in the mountains. If I've gone up, let's say I've gone into the fells and I've run myself silly for about 8-9 hours, and then afterwards, even just on my own, and that I'm increasingly loving that. I'm nowhere near Strava, and I love that. Just running for the sake of it. But if I run myself into a bit of a state afterwards, I feel like I did for several weeks after each of my kids was born. There's a little private bubble of everything's going to be okay, and I'm just utterly content. A kind of blissfulness, a kind of serenity. Yeah. Again, Vassos, I think that's where you might be a better writer than me. I might have lazily got to the orgasm button, and the way you're describing it, it is kind of a satisfied contentment. Definitely after a long run. Probably the magical moment is after a long run, ideally somewhere hilly, for the next hour. Well, the rest of the day usually, you maybe even the next. Contentment. And it's really interesting that you compare it to after becoming a parent, or after childbirth. Actually, I think in the book I do try and say, I think the most meaningful moments of my life, have either been in running or becoming, or when my 2 children were born. There was some kind of hormone chemical reaction, I think, in both of them that spread some sort of contentment. It's quite interesting, isn't it? But it's what do you think it is about the mountains that sort of speaks to us so deeply? I mean, you're in Wiltshire and I'm in London via Greece, and mountains don't feature very heavily certainly in my DNA, as far as I know, and maybe not in yours as well, but there's something about being in the mountains, isn't there?
Yeah, great question. I wonder if they just feel a bit more rugged and wild, and I don't know if primal is a stretch. I've always loved, before as a runner, I did love hiking as well, and a little bit of mountaineering, although nothing really dramatic. But there was something about, my wife, for example, she grew up by the sea. She loves the sea, and the sea's, I'm fine with the sea. It's okay every now and then, but I don't have a longing to be by the sea. But I do like to be at least by hills, if not mountains. And I think there's something about horizons. You can only see that far. So what must it be like to get to that point? What must the view be like over there? What must it feel like to get there? There's something about chasing a horizon, if that's not too much of a cliche, that resonates with me. Does that sound familiar to you, or is it a different?
Yeah, it does. It does. Although you should try. I know your wife's a big kind of winter swimmer, and you should try that because I've just got into it and it's awesome.
Yes, I'm curious about this. You were telling me just before we started recording, weren't you? So I said to you, "Have you been out for a run?" And you said, "No, you've been out for a swim." And I felt a tiny bit betrayed, if I'm honest. But tell me more about why you went out for a swim.
So I have lately, I mean, literally today's Monday, we're recording this. This started last Wednesday. I've been swimming through the winter and it's brilliant and it's great. And that's largely in the Thames, in the tidal Thames near where I live in Barnes. You have to pick your moments because occasionally there's a sewage dump. So don't go in when there's a load of poo in there. But there are, non-tidal bits as well. But it's just something, it's got a bit of that mountainness about it, sort of being in kind of big nature, even just the tidal Thames. And then I was in the North Sea yesterday above the Kent coast. But then this morning, and on the way to work now forevermore, and I work on a breakfast show, so this is, it takes something to get me out of bed 40 minutes earlier than the middle of the night, which is my normal wake-up time. But I will now be swimming in the Serpentine, which is just an ornamental lake in the centre of Hyde Park in London. But I'd always heard it opens for members at 5 a.m. and never quite believed it. And then I did go last week and it was open. And I now cannot imagine starting the day, certainly the working day, without a cold water. It won't be that cold in the summer soon, but without a swim. There's something about it. It's like the mountains. I can't quite put my finger on it, but it seems to be, speaking to my soul. Plus, gets me shivery, but also turbocharges me for the day. And the mountains do all of that for me.
Wow, that's interesting. I'm almost half tempted, except when you mentioned the sewage.
You got to worry about poo, but then that's an ultra run as well, isn't it? So there are very many similarities.
No, that's interesting. While you're here, Vassos, I can't resist. I want to ask you about. So this is you've got a book out as well, and this is your third running book, I believe. I'm really curious about. I was chatting to Darren Finn the other week, and he asked me sort of, I think there are many parallels between running and writing, and of course from distance you think they're totally opposite. One's very physical, one's sedentary, and so on. But I wanted to ask you the same question, because what I found the running really beneficial for the writing, in terms of, I think a lot of my best ideas, I'm not saying they're very good ideas, but best ideas for me come to me when I'm running or out walking sometimes. But that's when my mind gets active and good things happen up here. But what happens, of course, is I come home thinking I've got this great idea. I get my muddy shoes off, have a shower, do this and that, put the kettle on. And by that stage, I've forgotten what that great idea was. But I just wondered whether you had a similar, how was your process of writing, and how did it sort of intertwine with your
work? Well, the first book was sort of like a little bit of a celebration of just running, because I was, I'm that evangelical idiot who's just started running and realizing this is great. And I know loads of people know that, but I was running, and I was in Richmond Park, which, around where I come from is the best we can do. But it was winter, and I remember there was a low sun blinding my eyes, and I couldn't really see where I was going. And I was cold. I just run through a kind of icy puddle, and so one of my legs was soaking. My flimsy t-shirt was not keeping the cold out at all, even though I'd been going for an hour and a bit. And and I was just thinking I should be miserable, but there's me and there's my dog, the Labrador Holly, who's fantastic. She had an enormous stick in her mouth, and she was probably cold and wet too, because she was definitely wet and it was freezing. But her tail was like wagging around in windmills. And I remember thinking that actually her and I are about as happy as it's possible to be. And I want to write to celebrate this feeling. And I always remember that every time, if I don't know what to write, if I don't know where I'm going with a certain story, I go out for a run and I just sort of put stuff back there, and I just sort of suddenly glimpse that that mindfulness that you do get when you're running, especially outside in nature. And yes, you're right. The answer just comes to me. It was almost like I'm just the conduit. So there we have it. Sorry, slightly romantic answer, but I do really, really, really love it. And incidentally, this is really awesome. I cannot recommend it highly enough. I'm really loving it.
Oh, you're very, very kind. Thank you very much. But
It's out now.
I think it's out very early May. Very, very. Yeah, it's very soon. Yes.
In it for the long run, breaking records and getting FKT. And by the way, and I'm delighted to see that no opportunity for an FKT pun is left unused.
Nothing's too childish for me, I promise. Yeah, it's too much. It's too much of a good initialism to use, I think. But you're very kind. Thank you. But yeah, what about? Is there another running book for you on there?
I don't think so. No, I wasn't going to write another one. I did the one, and then I was so taken. Then they asked me to write another one, and I said, "Yeah, fine, but I've got into ultra running now, and so you're going to have to let me write about ultra running if you want me to write another book." And I thought they'd say, "No, that's a stupid niche sport done by stupid people like you." But they actually said, "Fine, actually, that would be lovely. So write one celebrating the ultra." And then I did, and you know, with my very few successes and my very many failures thrown in, but that's the half the point of the whole thing. You know, you don't know at the start whether or how it's going to finish, and I love that. And I thought, well, that's me done writing about running. Thank you very much. And I'm, you know, thrilled when people say, "I read your book and it inspired me to run an ultra," because that was utterly the point. And then blimmin' Chris Evans, who I work with on the radio every morning on Virgin Radio, said, "Why don't you write a book for people who haven't run marathons yet, called How to Run a Marathon?" I thought, well, that's a very good title. That is a very good title. So yes, why don't I do that? And actually, I really loved writing it because it got me back on the road, and I didn't think I'd get back on the road at all. And you know, the best thing about writing a book called How to Run a Marathon is you get to run loads of marathons, and you can tell your wife that it's for work. And I very much enjoyed interviewing some fantastic people. So the first section is sort of why everybody should, and then I get to talk to some really fantastic world-renowned experts to give, you know, tips on training and nutrition and injury prevention and you know, mental strength and all that stuff, how everybody can. And I actually really enjoyed writing it, but I can tell you now, a bit like Steve Redgrave in that boat, you know, I am done writing about running, even though I really like it. I think the world has had enough of me and my words about writing. Yes, we get it, Vassos, you like running. Next.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised if it isn't your last one, but I've got a question I'm intrigued to ask you is, and what I was sort of trying to answer in my book or struggling to understand is, yeah, the big one, I suppose, the why. Like, why do you think you and me and lots of other people like to do these long, seemingly very hurty things? It could be a marathon, it could be more. Why do you want to do those things?
Yeah, I think for me, you know, there's a lot of different, you know, you ask 20 different people that question and there's probably 20 different answers, but each of them is as valid. And I think the reason I love it so much is that I actually have all of those 20 answers, you know, on different days, and sometimes all of them on the same day. Yes, I do it for kind of self-discovery, and yes, I do it for fitness, and yes, I do it for therapy, and yes, I do it for mindfulness, and yes, I do it for the challenge, and yes, I do it because actually when you strip yourself bare like that and then, you know, you put yourself back together, what emerges is often a slightly better version of yourself. So that, I mean, for me, I think that's the why. And I have really missed in the last couple of years, actually, since I've last run a proper event. The last race I ran was the Athens Marathon in late November 2019. So that's like 18 months without running. I mean, I've run longer than 30 miles since then, and I've done, you know, my own little challenges in the Surrey Hills, and I've been in the Lake District, as I've told you, running over fells gleefully, but nothing kind of organized and nothing in the diary and nothing to train for and nothing to plan for. And I've really missed that.
Oh, that's really interesting. Well, I hope that can sort of return soon. It looks like that.
It looks like it is, doesn't it? So one last question for you, actually two last questions for you, Damian. number one, we're speaking the morning after the 100-mile world record was broken on the track. Would you ever be tempted to, I mean, this is the London Mountain Film Festival, and we're talking about running around a track many thousands of times, but would you ever be tempted by that sort of thing?
I think I've got to say I'd never say never. But yeah, it sounds horrible, horribly brutal. And like I say earlier, I suppose people think that 100 miles in the mountains sounds tough. To me, that sounds much tougher. I'm perfectly happy doing 100 miles in the mountains. Yeah, it sounds awful, but I am still intrigued as to I guess endurance in general, but also just the mind, where the mind goes during all of that. I think I will try one at one point.
Yeah, I think I will too.
Yeah,
or a 24-hour challenge. I was talking to Debs Martin Consani about this, and she said you have to really want it, otherwise you will find a reason to stop. Just before, she told me a very funny story about how she was 18 hours into a 24-hour track race, and she went to the loo, and she sort of very gingerly had to sort of lower herself down onto the loo, as you would do because you'd just been running 18 hours. But the previous occupant of this portaloo had missed. So what she did was she put her hand on basically a pile of feces, and then she had nowhere to sort of wipe it. So she had to then spend the next 6 hours running with a glove of someone else's poo underneath her fingernails and everywhere. And every time she wanted to wipe her face, she had to remember that there's someone else's poo on my hands. So there's that to sort of factor into the whole equation as well. And
I've just realised that
that we don't.
The theme of our conversation actually is that human-made matter. We started off with that.
Yes.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah. So I'm gonna just move on so that people aren't left with poo as their overriding memory of our conversation, and just to talk about the fastest known time. This sort of explosion of interest in the fastest known time. Can you just talk a bit about that? How did you decide that this was something that you were, if I was to give you like a legendary status? So Bob Graham FKT, not broken for your whole life, or victory in the UTMB, which would you take?
Oh gosh. I really don't know. Let me think. Oh, you've got me there. Which do you think I should take? I don't know.
I hope you'd say Bob Graham, but UTMB would be a good practical answer. You'd get loads of dosh for that as well, wouldn't you? And you get like sponsorship would like flood in.
Oh wow, I'm trying to think. But I suppose with UTMB, people, they kind of, not that this is the most important thing, but someone else would win it the next year, then the next year, then the next year, and after a while people would forget. But if you've got a Bob Graham record for 30 years, then your name gets repeated. But I suppose that sounds a bit egotistical, but then I'm only human. Yeah, I'll go for the Bob Graham. I'll go for the Bob Graham, actually. Yeah.
Good answer.
Thank you. Do you know any good shortcuts on them? You've been recceing it. Do you know any good shortcuts where I can
I'll message
4 or 5
you
hours?
privately. Yeah. Great stuff, Damien. It's been a real pleasure to meet you. Actually, we've never been in the same place at the same time before, so it's been a real treat. Congratulations once again on the book. In it for the long run, very much recommended, and hopefully catch up soon.
Thank you very much, and it was really nice to meet up, and good luck for your book and your next one, and good luck at the Bob Graham, and it'd be nice to meet up finally someday soon.